Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 12th Mama Charitable Foundation Visiting Professor in Buddhist Studies lecture series. The theme of the series this time is Buddhisms in Japan, Pilgrimage, Ritual, Thought. Today is the third lecture and also the last one in the series, and we are very happy and honored to have invited Professor Richard Payne again to share with us his wisdom and insight. Before the lecture begins, I would like to invite Professor Catherine Hardy from the HKU Center of Buddhist Studies to introduce Professor Payne. Professor Hardy, please.
Thank you, Carol, and good evening, venerables, teachers, students, and friends. It's so wonderful to have you all here for the third and culminating lecture in Professor Payne's series. And I think we're all feeling quite excited. We've been taken on a journey through Japanese pilgrimage to fire offering rituals, and tonight we're going to end with a discussion of thought. So, for those of you who have been at the earlier lectures, Professor Payne doesn't need any introduction, but for those of you who might be joining you tonight, let me give you a snapshot of him. So, Professor Payne graduated from the Theological Union of Berkeley in 1985. His research area is Tantric Buddhist ritual, particularly the Tantric fire ritual. And after a career of 30 years of teaching and administration at the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley, he retired in 2023 and is now Professor Emeritus. He continues now as a member of the steering committee of the Society for Tantric Studies. And with Professor Halkias here, he's also the co-editor of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Buddhism. Professor Payne also established the Pure Land Buddhist Studies Series with the University of Hawaii Press, and also the Contemporary Issues in Buddhist Studies Series with the Institute of Buddhist Studies. So please join me again in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Payne.
Good evening, and thank you for coming out once again to join us this evening for the third and last of the 12th annual Mama Charitable Foundation lectures. As was mentioned, the topic tonight is on Buddhist thought, and I realize that's a really large topic, and I hope that you'll bear with me as I focus particularly on the issue of context. Not so much am I concerned here, although the body of this will have to do with specifics of Buddhist ideas in Japan. But I also want to then step back and look at how do we understand those? How do we interpret those? And that's where the issue of context comes in. So the importance of context. Context, I think, is central to interpretation. Right? There is no interpretation that does not have a context. There is no way of explaining something that doesn't exist in relationship to something else, that does not exist in isolation. So sometimes some scholars have talked as if, well, there's this thing and it has this meaning, as if the meaning was attached to the thing itself, right? So you have a fire ritual, so it means offerings to the gods, as if that was a fixed relationship, right? The point that I'm trying to make is that the context within which, the setting, the way it's used, is all part of how we interpret it and changes the meaning. There is no fixed meaning. Therefore, there is no one right understanding. This is something that I will repeat tonight several times, and I hope that you don't get too irritated with how often I repeat it. But different contexts provide different ways of understanding. So I would like to explore two examples. First is a set of three of the Kamakura era schools in the context of Tantric Buddhism, that is of Shingon and Tendai, and second, Buddhist thought in the context of Western academic disciplines. Yeah. So these are two examples that I want to explore how it is that Buddhist ideas have different meanings depending upon how they're being looked at, what the context is. So the question that I asked myself in getting started with this project, this piece of the lecture series, is what context is it that helps us to understand more about Japanese Buddhism? What is the proper framework within which to think about Japanese Buddhism that helps us to know more about it, to appreciate it more deeply? Right? So one perspective is a sectarian one that only looks at the founder in isolation. One perspective is to locate them, the founder, in a specific lineage. Right? And a third is to locate that person in the historical and intellectual antecedents more generally. Now, I'm working with the founder. One could work with any other kind of piece, but this is where a lot of emphasis in the study of Japanese Buddhism has been located, particularly in the Kamakura era. Great deal of focus on the set of founders who started the different sects in Kamakura era. So then the question is, are the Kamakura era sectarian teachings new developments or not? Because oftentimes that's kind of the way it's presented in Japanese Buddhist scholarship. This is the new Buddhism of the Kamakura era. It's a break from what went before. It's all, we're kind of like going to ignore what went before and just look at what new ideas were being developed and propagated during the Kamakura era. So taking three founders, one is Dogen, who emphasizes just sitting is awakening. One is Nichiren, who emphasizes chanting the name of the Lotus Sutra assures awakening. And one is Shinran, reciting the name of Amida assures awakening. Now these are just three examples. There are a number of other founders. And even beyond the set of teachers who are considered founders of new forms of Buddhism in the Kamakura era, there are many teachers who were working within established sectarian identities. Okay? These are just three that we can look at for our purposes here. Now, these three teachings are not the same. Right? That just sitting as awakening is not the same as chanting the name of the Lotus Sutra, is not the same as reciting the name of Amida. Right? But they share a particularly important characteristic that I want to highlight, which is that they are distinct from older ideas of gradually accumulating insight and merit for countless lifetimes, eon after eon. Right? Getting better and better, accumulating over thousands and thousands of lifetimes. That was a model of the Buddhist path to awakening. Here instead, all three of these teachers are suggesting that there is an alternative to this path that takes countless rebirths. That it's a short path and can be attaining awakening quickly. Okay? So that's a very radically different concept from the majority of Buddhism up to this time. Okay? It's also in developments in India and China as well, so this is not unique to Japan, but it's an important shift. So Dogen is famous as the person who established the Soto Zen school in Japan. His, memorable slogans, reducing complex sets of ideas down to a little phrase, is often very handy. His phrase, or the phrase that is associated with him, is Sokushin Zeibutsu. This mind becomes Buddha. This mind is awakened. So just sitting, shikantaza, one is already awakened. There's nothing to achieve. Sitting is being Buddha. Practice and awakening are inseparable. And I'll call attention to the fact that Dogen was trained on Mount Hiei in the Tendai tradition. Okay. So this is one of the core ideas of Dogen's teachings about Zen. Nichiren emphasizes the power of the Lotus Sutra. And the Lotus Sutra is so powerful that in Nichiren's view, even the name of it is powerful. And the name can be recited. Clearly, this is an adaptation of mantra. Right? They don't call it mantra because they want to be different from that other stuff, but basically it's a kind of mantra. And the mantra is Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. Honor to the true Dharma, Lotus Sutra. And for Nichiren, this practice is adequate. This practice is a means of expressing not only one's devotion to the Lotus Sutra and to the teachings of Nichiren, but also a way to realize, to make real one's inherent Buddha nature. And again, Nichiren was trained on Mount Hiei in the Tendai tradition. Shinran is considered the person who established the true Pure Land Buddhism, Jodo Shinshu. There is debate in the tradition whether or not the Shin of Jodo Shinshu means true or accurate, or just how to interpret that, because Shinran himself said, I'm just giving the proper interpretation of my teacher Honin's teachings. I'm not creating something new. I'm just giving the way that Honin meant to teach Pure Land teachings. Yeah? So for Shinran, reciting the name of Amida is the effective means of attaining awakening. Namo Amida Butsu, that is honor to the Buddha Amida, Amitabha, Amitoho. And as few as 10 recitations, right? This is a specific phrase in one of the three major texts of the Jodo Shinshu tradition, that as few as 10 recitations of the name of Amida with a concentrated mind, with a sincere heart, is enough to assure birth in the Pure Land. And that's really valuable, because this, our present world, also known as the Saha world, right? Here, things are not very good. You may not have noticed, right? I mean, Hong Kong is really a happening place, right? It's cool. But here, in this world, it's difficult, if not impossible, to actually accurately hear the teachings. I'm trying really hard, and I'm probably not doing an adequate job, and it's difficult to hear the teachings of the Dharma. And it's even more difficult to put it into effective practice. This is not a good place to get started towards awakening in this view of the Jodo Shinshu tradition, right? But there's an alternative. The sutras tell us that Amitabha, has engaged in countless eons of austerities, yogic practices, and generated so much power that he has vowed that upon his awakening, there will be a Pure Land where we can be reborn. And that Pure Land makes it possible for us to hear the teachings accurately and to put them into effective practice. But the traditional view of the Pure Land is that it's kind of a staging ground. Right? You are reborn there, are able to hear the Buddha teaching and put those teachings into practice, and from there attain awakening. Right? Shinran's interpretation tweaked that more than a little in a pretty significant way. Shinran says, actually, rebirth in the Pure Land is equivalent to, is identical with, is being awakened. So here is another rapid path with a single practice. So the phrase there is immediate achievement of birth in the Pure Land. Sokotoku Ojo. So we have 3 Kamakura era Buddhist teachers, each presenting a different teaching, but underneath that, they all share a common ideal, that it is not necessary to spend countless eons accumulating merit and insight, but that one can attain awakening in a very, very short way, shortening the path to making it readily accessible. So if we think about the context of interpretation, how do we understand each of these, right? So we have 3 different teachings. As a unique insight of religious genius, or as having been developed in a particular intellectual and social context. The context, this is pretty abstract stuff, so I hope that you'll hang in with me while I try to go through this in a systematic fashion. Context defines meaning. Right? Nothing exists without context. It is a relation between things that give them meaning. This idea is probably be, for me at least, traced back to structuralist linguistics at the end of the 19th century, right? Where meaning emerges out of the relationship between things, between terms, between words. No word in isolation has any meaning. It only takes on meaning because it's not this other word. And it's similar to this word, and it's related to this word. And it's all of these relationships that give the word meaning. And even more fundamentally, our thought processes work on the basis of similarities and differences. That's how, at the most basic level, at the neuronal level, way back here in the back of the brain, we're seeing similarities and differences in the visual field, right? And then that gets interpreted and interpreted and interpreted. Until now, instead of, oh, this line is parallel to that line and these lines are parallel to each other, now I'm seeing an auditorium filled with chairs with attentive people. Thank you very much. Right? No context, no meaning. Nothing exists in isolation. This is the significance of the teaching of interconnectedness. Now, I'm not saying that this approach to interpretation, this approach to understanding things, comes from Buddhism, but it certainly is congruent. It certainly matches up really, really well. Nothing exists in isolation. This is the significance of the teaching of interconnectedness in Buddhism, that all things are interconnected. And the meaning of emptiness is that there is no essence in the thing itself. So two of the major ideas of Buddhist thought, interconnectedness and emptiness, are match so closely. I mean, it's terribly congruent with an emphasis on context for how we think about, how we go about understanding the teachings. So Tantric Buddhism is an important part of the context of the Kamakura era doctrines. Now I want to take, okay, so here's our, we're going to back up, right? We've got Kamakura with Dogen, Shinran, and Nichiren. And behind them are Kukai and Saicho. But before we get to them, I'm going to go even further back to Indian Buddhist thought, because that provides a common basis of shared concepts that informed Kukai and Saicho, and were still part of the shared worldview shared by Nichiren and the other two guys. Oh, Dogen and Shinran. Okay, so we go back to India. Conveniently, there's another set of three. It is a scientific fact that it's a lot easier to remember sets of three than 4 or 5. 6 we begin to get a little iffy. 3 is really handy. It's a nice set of things to work with. And conveniently, there are 3 schools of Indian Buddhist thought that provide the background for Japanese Buddhism. And these are really famous and maybe familiar to you. One is Madhyamaka, one is Yogacara or Vijñapti Matrata, and one is Tathagatagarbha. And these provide emphasize an informal conceptual basis for the tantric teachings of Kukai and Saicho. I say informal because it's not like everybody was sitting around talking about these concepts in detailed doctrinal discussions or reading the big doctrinal texts. This is stuff that was permeating the culture. Things that came up basically in lectures that priests were giving, even if they weren't formal doctrinal discourses. They came up in literature and in poetry. The aesthetic of impermanence that is pervasive in Japanese poetry and literature directly derives from these concepts. And it's not because people were studying doctrine in a deep, detailed way. It's just part of a shared culture. Right? I once got criticized for a paper in which I tried to make this point by talking about Santa Claus. This appeared to be too trivial an example, right? But I will share it with you because I think it's a really good one, right? In the United States, there is no deep, rich doctrinal text that teaches us about Santa Claus and what he does, right? There's the night before Christmas. 'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. All the stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. And that's where my recollection runs out. But, that's as close to a sacred text for Christmas, for Santa Claus, that American society has, this little poem, right? And yet, everybody knows who Santa Claus is. Everybody knows what Santa Claus does. There are Christmas songs talk about Santa Claus coming down the chimney, right? Little children in Ohio leave plates of cookies and cups of milk out for Santa Claus. And in the morning, when they come out to look for their presents, the cookies are gone and the milk's been drunk. Santa Claus has been here, right? Everybody knows, and we don't know how we know because it's just such a pervasive part of the culture. And in Japanese Buddhist culture, the ideas of impermanence were equally pervasive without anybody having to be taught them. Right? Madhyamaka Yogacara Tathagata. Okay. Here we get into details about Madhyamaka. Madhyamaka is the middle way. There's an emphasis on emptiness. 4 stages of realizing emptiness. The first is the one that, again, everybody in mindfulness groups in the United States kind of has heard about that, and it's the emptiness of persons, the emptiness of self. And they're really not sure about Buddhism because that sounds kind of squirrely. That's weird, right? What do you mean I don't have a self? Well, what I mean is you don't have a self. You don't have a permanent, eternal, absolute, personal self. That's what you don't have. Yes, we have egos, we can operate in the world, we can, arrange to meet for dinner before the lecture, we can handle all this coordinating stuff because we've got the ego self that handles that, but there's no permanent self beyond that. Then there's the emptiness of phenomena, the emptiness of things. Things have no permanent, eternal, absolute essence. So we'll come to this. We will be pounding on the podium to make this point. Then there's great emptiness, which unfortunately looks a lot like it's kind of depressing, right? That nothing exists, there's, no purpose, why go on? Oh God, it's so hard. There's a famous story from the sutras about a monk who was having a really, really hard time. He could not meditate worth, just really bad at it, right? I'm sure that we can, all who have attempted to meditate, have the ability to kind of feel like, yeah, sometimes it's just really impossible, right? So this monk comes to the Buddha and says, I'm throwing in the towel, man. I'm giving it up, throwing in the towel. Do you know that that's a boxing reference? Anyway, so it means to give up. And I'm sure that the monk did not use that expression when he was talking to the Buddha. He said, I'm going to quit. I'm going to go back to the lay life. And the Buddha looked at him and said, oh, okay, here's some clothes. Give me your robes. And the monk changes his clothes, goes back to the village, finds a beautiful, beautiful woman there to marry. And he builds a house and he starts farming, and they have children, and the farm prospers, and they have grandchildren, and he's getting old, and he's getting close to dying, and suddenly the Buddha snaps him out of it. All of this has been an illusion to convince him that there is nothing permanent. He will not get satisfaction in going in that direction. And once he sees that everything is impermanent in that way, he comes back into the Sangha, goes back into training, and progresses to the next stage, the stage of non-dual emptiness, in which one realizes that even emptiness is empty. Emptiness is not an absolute. Emptiness has no inherent existence in itself. It is, as Nagarjuna tells us, it is simply a word, a label that we use to talk about the characteristic of existing things. Right? And this is the slogan for Madhyamaka, which is called the Two Truths, which I belabor this because it is so often, I believe, misunderstood and misrepresented in the Western philosophic discourse about Buddhism. It's presented as if it were absolute and relative. And I think if you look at what Nagarjuna actually says in the text, that's not what he's talking about at all. He's not talking about some absolute and some relative. He's talking about conditioned and empty, and that these are two faces of the same actuality. Here is my feel free to use it bumper sticker reduction of Madhyamaka doctrine. Everything exists, nothing is real. Everything exists as a result of causes and conditions. When those causes and conditions change, that thing will change as well. And nothing is real because there is nothing that is permanent, eternal, absolute, and unchanging. Okay, so, 5 words. I thought I had it down to 4, but we have a verb in there. Everything exists, nothing is real. Those are the two truths. And they ultimately mean the same thing. It's just two different ways of looking at the same actuality. And a little discourse on Plato here, a little side journey. And I'm sure that I will get this wrong because I know that Professor Halkias is much more of an expert on this topic than I am, but a little bit, maybe. Just a little dose of Plato in contrast. So for Plato, the two are the absolute and the relative. It is the absolute, eternal, permanent, and unchanging that is real, the ideal forms, the transcendent. Everything of this world is a mere shadow of that higher reality, transitory and impermanent, and ultimately not of any value. And there are essences to things that determine what they are. The form of the table is what makes some object of wood or metal a table. So there's the ideal form of table, sometimes called table-ness. And to the extent that this object participates in or has tableness present, that's what makes it a table. Yeah. And in my view, the Buddhist teachings are basically the opposite of this kind of Platonic dualism. Madhyamaka, one school, Yogacara, another. Yogacara is also one of the Indian Mahayana schools, very influential, and also a very complex one. There's a number of different interpretations, and leading scholars in Buddhist studies today disagree vehemently about how to understand the Yogacara teachings. So this is just a very light summary. And I can assure you, they do the same thing with the Madhyamaka teachings as well, right? But for some reason, Yogacara seems to attract more vehemence. Yogacara looks at the processes of mind, how the mind works. And in that school, what they say is that everything is merely a representation, right? And this is one of those very complex phrases. What does this mean? It means that all that we can know are representations, right? And sometimes this is taken to mean that things don't exist independently of us, that there's no real world out here. In the interpretations of Yogacara that I think are better, or at least that I like more, there are external things, we just can't know them, not directly. What we know are representations. Right? The things that exist are in a dialectic with our perception of them. The thing exists and we perceive them. And for this reason, there is no attachment, no need to be attached to the ongoing dynamic flow of things. Yeah. So again, this is emphasizing movement and transitoriness, that the processes of mind keep cycling through perception, interpretation, memory, perception, interpretation, memory. Memory informs perception, informs interpretation, lays down a new memory. So this is a constant, ongoing process. And Tathagata, of which there are two main interpretations. Now, unlike Madhyamaka, which you may have noticed was capitalized, and Yogacara, which was also capitalized, Tathagata was not a specific school. It was an idea that was shared very influentially among a lot of people, okay? And became very influential in East Asian Buddhism. So there are two interpretations. One is that, and the ambiguity, although there are those scholars who claim to have resolved this ambiguity, but the ambiguity resides in the term garba. Right? Tathagata is a title for the Buddha, one who has come thus or gone thus. Right? Garba can either mean womb or embryo. Right? It's either a place of potentiality or an existing thing. So there are those two basic interpretations of the Tathagata. It is a present actuality that develops, that grows. It is already present, but requires propagation through practice. Or it's a possibility that becomes actual. It is something that one creates through practice. Yeah. This is the source of the idea of Buddha nature, right? That all sentient beings have the nature of being Buddhas. Yeah. Okay, so we were back here in India, right? And now we're going to come up to Heian era Japan. We're still behind the Kamakura era, guys. Kukai. So drawing out of the similarities and the foundations, the shared foundations in Tantric thought, the context that all three of the Kamakura era teachers were sharing was the immediacy of awakening. In Shingon, Kukai established the tradition. The slogan for him is Sokushin Jobutsu. Awakening occurs in this body, in this lifetime. Ritual and practice allows the practitioner to experience their always and already awakened nature. Right? This is linking to the idea of the Tathagata. This is not a gradual accumulation of merit and insight, but a revealing or a realization. Okay? The term realization in English is rooted in the concept to make real. Right? And the immediacy of awakening is shared with the Tendai tradition. Saicho, slightly senior to Kukai, established the Tendai tradition in Japan. And for him, the slogan is, original enlightenment, hongaku, that at the very base, at the root, hon means the base of the tree, right? One is enlightened. All sentient beings are already awakened. Being already present, awakening is not a potential to be developed or a goal to be achieved. Again, it is a reality to be recognized. So both of these tantric streams in Heian era Japan taught versions of the immediacy of awakening. So these ideas, Saicho's concept of original awakening and Kukai's awakening in this lifetime, form the historical and intellectual background for the rise of Kamakura-era teachings. They are the framework within which the Kamakura teachers did their own creative work, developing their ideas of just sitting as awakening, birth in the Pure Land is awakening, reciting the name of the Lotus Sutra realizes one's own inherent awakening, one's Buddha nature. So I said that there's different contexts yield different understandings, different interpretations. I'm really sorry for the denseness of the text on some of these slides. Which is why I'm trying to take time to work through them for you, with you. So is Nichiren only to be understood as the founder of the Nichiren Shu, or as a transmitter of a version of Tendai Lotus teachings, or in his own historical and cultural location? Is Dogen to be understood as the founder of Soto Zen, or as the transmitter of the Caodong school from China, or in his own historical and cultural location? Is Shinran only to be understood as the founder of Jodo Shinshu, or as this transmitter of Shandao's Pure Land teachings from China, or in his own historical and cultural location? Framing the question of what context do we place these founders and their ideas in to understand them? Each of these three ways of understanding, of interpreting these teachers and their teachings, provides a different perspective, allows us to see different aspects. No one of these three perspectives is the correct perspective. Some may yield more interesting information than others, but there's not one that is correct and the others that are wrong. So there's the importance, as I see it, of the idea of context for looking at the Kamakura-era teachers, right? So you have three, several other as well, but three major figures, each of whom promoted their own interpretation, their own understanding, their own ideas about the Dharma and its practice. And we can understand that they had their context included either as the founder of that specific school or as the transmitter of something in the history of Buddhism, or in the framework of seeing them as reinterpreting in a creative fashion the teaching of the immediacy of awakening that was shared by Saicho and Kukai. The reason that I pointed out that Shinran, Dogen, and Nichiren were all trained on Mount Hiei means that they were trained in the school of Saicho. Right? So they were originally trained and exposed to these ideas in Saicho's interpretation, right? Even before they left the mountain, went off and started something of their own anew. So there is a biographical fact as well as a historical and social fact, as well as a lineage fact, as well as the fact of their own creativity. I know that that was a lot to absorb. Would you like to ask questions at this point? Or shall I plunge ahead into a related structure of emphasizing? Okay, it looks like you're either numbed by the brilliance of my presentation or you just want to go ahead. Okay, I will assume that it's the latter. The Western academic study of Buddhism usually places Buddhism in one of three categories. Is Buddhist thought philosophy? There are a lot of people who say, yes, it's philosophy. Is it religion? And a whole bunch of people say, yes, it's religion. Is it psychology? And a whole bunch of people say, yes, it's psychology. And sometimes those are the same people, right? And sometimes there are other people who say, no, it's something else. It's a lifestyle. It's a way of achieving personal realization. But in the academic study, it's generally these three categories that Buddhism is discussed in relationship to. Now, I emphasized that that is not necessarily the case in a Buddhist studies program. Right? But outside of programs that are devoted to Buddhist studies as such, generally in the academic world, these are the three categories. And these are also the three categories that often get repeated in the popular discourse, magazines and newspapers, right? Including many of the Buddhist glossy magazines as well. They talk about these are the three ways that Buddhism is thought about. Now, what I want to emphasize is that something very significant happens when Buddhism is made to fit into each of these three discourses, each of these three ways of talking about Buddhism. The first is that each of the three only look at a part of the Buddhist tradition. Right? None of them are going to look at the entirety. Right? And in doing so, each acts as a kind of filter. Right? It selects out particular aspects of the Buddhist tradition as important. And even more so, what is important is determined by each of the three disciplines, not by something in the Buddhist tradition itself that says, oh, this is important. It's not like the Buddhist, it's not like they're looking at those judgments within the Buddhist tradition. They're saying, for our discipline, for our way of talking about Buddhism, this is what's important, or this is what's important. So it selects out particular aspects. So philosophy, long history, lots of complexity. Academic field has some pretty well-defined areas of specialization, those being metaphysics or ontology, that is discussion about the nature of being or the structures of existence, value theory, axiology, things like ethics and aesthetics, epistemology, the theory of knowledge, how do we know things? How can we claim to be sure about things? Logic, rational discourse, how does one construct an argument? What are the kinds of fallacies that one can fall into? And of course, all of the philosophies of, such as philosophy of language, philosophy of science, philosophy of religion, and even philosophy of Buddhism. Religious studies historically, religious studies as an academic discipline begins around sometime in the second half of the 19th century. Okay. There are antecedents, people who were doing work, thinking about religion in ways that weren't exactly fitting into their culture. But around that time, Europeans became exposed more extensively to non-European religious cultures. And they began to have to think real hard about what does that mean. I mean, up until that time, it had been pretty easy. There were Christians, pagans, and heathens, right? And they had definitions for each of the three of these. Pagans, as I recall, were people who had heard about Christianity but rejected it. Heathens were people who hadn't heard about Christianity, right? And then there was Christianity. You can see how, Christianity-centered this category system is. It takes for granted this is the basic thing and then marks the others as different, right? But in the second half of the 19th century, there was increasing contact with cultures in Africa, South America, North America, Asia, right? And increasing study of the traditions of those cultures. But the framework had already been set by Protestant Christianity, right? I mentioned before those three categories were based on there's Christianity and then the other. Well, in the formation of religious studies, Protestant Christianity provided the model of what a religion is, right? They kind of abstracted out of the specifics of Protestant Christianity and said, okay, so that's what religion in general has these characteristics. This was not something that they consciously did, right? This was pretty much an unconscious that's what we're familiar with. So that's what religion must be, right? Such categories as devotion and prayer, the idea that a religion is structured around a founder, that person's unique teachings, the book that it's recorded in, and a church that is established to propagate those teachings. The idea that belief is what saves you, and oftentimes an emphasis on exclusive membership. Okay? So these are just some of the categories, some of the characteristics coming out of Protestant Christianity that were taken as the normal model of what a religion is. Psychology, even more modern of a discipline. I mean, you get from the second half of the 19th century to just around the turn of the, end of the 20th century. That includes a theory of how the mind works, many times structured in terms of content and process. That is, what is the content of the mind? How does the mind work to process those contents, right? And some psychologies emphasize one, others emphasize the other, others try to work on both of those. There's a presumption that the mind is the center of human existence. It's that's where things kind of start for psychology. Focus on thoughts, feelings, motivations, symbolic interpretation of actions or dreams is shared by many forms of psychology. And oftentimes, there is a therapeutic system involved. The idea that, we can identify the problems and figure out how to fix them. Right? we're going to have a diagnostic system, and then we're going to figure out what caused that problem, and then we're going to figure out how to fix it, and then we're going to apply that fix to you. Right? So a therapeutic culture. This pervades much of the self-help culture in the United States, including the mindfulness movement as well. Okay, so these very, very brief characterizations are only intended to be suggestive, not comprehensive. This is not a thorough examination of philosophy, psychology, and religious studies. I hope that that was really obvious, right? Each of these three discourses is, of course, more complicated and multifaceted. The examples are intended to indicate, however, how the discourse acts as a filter, selecting particular aspects and distorting those by making them fit into a different pattern of understanding, a different context from where they came from in Buddhism. And I want to emphasize, this is not malign. This is not intentional. None of the people who do this kind of work are out to undermine Buddhism somehow. Well, except maybe some of the people in religious studies, but they've got their own agendas. And psychologically speaking, I think they've got their own problems. But okay, for the most part, most of the academics who do work in these fields are not malign. They're not intending to undermine. But the kind of selectivity and distortion that results is inevitable. It's unavoidable. I mentioned before that sometimes I have a minority position about some things. My view that this kind of selective filtering and necessary distortion is inevitable is not shared by all of my colleagues. There are those who work in the area of the philosophy of Buddhism who want to transform philosophy so as to be able to more accurately include Buddhism. I beg to disagree. I don't think that you can ever escape 2,500 years of intellectual history determining what the concepts, categories, and concerns of a discipline are, and just transform it in the course of a few generations by trying to include Dharmakirti or Nagarjuna into the Western philosophic curriculum. Okay. I'm a very opinionated person. Have you noticed that? I have a lot of strong opinions, and I'm glad to be able to share them all with you. So if we look at Buddhism, it has a 2,500-year history. More or less, we don't know for sure. You know, some people say longer, some people say shorter. It has existed across all the cultures in Asia, and now globally. It has a canon of thousands of texts in multiple languages, in Pali, Sanskrit, Chinese, Tibetan, and several other languages. You know, and not, if we don't limit ourselves to full canons, then we get even more languages. You know? And with many different lineages of teachings. You look at that great mass, and certainly it's the case that parts of Buddhism do match what each of the three academic disciplines consider important. There's something in there, right? And because they do match, those selective interpretations become what are called overdetermined. More than one reason to support that interpretation. There's a part on the Western side of the academic disciplines that match with something on the Buddhist side, and that matching seems to make that interpretation valid and appropriate and the right interpretation. So being overdetermined means that they are considered to be accurate and legitimate because they match. But that conclusion ignores the selective process that preceded it. Right? What matched was already being selected. So we have three in Western academia, and I'm, of course, generalizing here greatly. We have three interpretive frames, contexts for understanding Buddhism: philosophy, psychology, and religion. Each of the three select aspects of Buddhism that are relevant to their own concepts, categories, and concerns. And this little set of three, another set of three, concepts, categories, and concerns, is handy to me because it covers what are the ideas that are used in that particular academic discipline. What are the ideas? What are the concepts? What are the categories? How are things organized in that academic discipline? And what are the concerns? What are the issues that people working in that field are trying to address? So concepts, categories, and concerns. And then they interpret Buddhist teachings in terms of those. For example, philosophy might emphasize the theory of knowledge, but without attention to devotion. Right? And I have seen that in some philosophical work on Buddhism. There's a big text, and it'll have a devotional part, beginning and in the middle, somewhere in there, right? There's prayers of the Buddha, Bodhisattvas, all that's all ignored, right? They go in between all that, and they'll pick out the stuff that looks like epistemology, that looks like theory of knowledge, right? So that'll be selected out. But for the Buddhist author who wrote that, or, the committee who put it together, who compiled it, and the editors who worked on it over centuries, there was a reason that that stuff was there. It's not lightly to be ignored. Right? There's a reason that there's a devotional component in relationship to the discussion of theory of knowledge. Psychology might emphasize the therapeutic use of meditation. Right? And this, in fact, has received a lot of attention in the Western popular press. In fact, something just popped up on my search engine recently. Right? Yet another set of studies about, well, can you meditate, and what does that mean? Does that make you a better person? Or so on. So, a therapeutic use of meditation, but without attention to morality, to sila, to the fundamental necessity of committing your life in a particular direction. And religious studies might emphasize the idea of a text containing the founder's teachings. Right? I mean, it's really, you can carry Christianity around in a single book, right? And it's got a bunch of chapters and stuff. And I found one in the drawer in my hotel room, right? You can't do that with Buddhism, right? So thinking that there's a text distorts the complexity of the textual history of Buddhism, the vast array of the Buddhist canon, the stuff that Buddhist scholars are going to be busy with for probably another 1,000 years, by which time the languages will have changed and we'll be doing something all over again. But when thinking about a particular interpretation, it is important to ask, do we learn more from that interpretation? That is, technical term is, what is its heuristic value? What does it yield in additional understanding, in additional appreciation, in additional knowledge? While at the same time, keeping in mind that it is only one interpretation. It might be a really juicy one, right? It might open up to us a whole lot of different ways of thinking about something in the Buddhist tradition, about thinking about rituals or thinking about meditation. But it's not the only interpretation, no matter how much value it yields for us There are other ways of looking. So, Japan has long been my special area of focus. And if this sounds like wrapping up, you're right. But the kind of analysis that I've offered here, what is the context? What is the perspective? What is the framework? Applies to understanding not just Japanese Buddhist teachings or even Buddhist teachings more generally. For example, context applies to everything that someone tries to convince you of. We can ask questions about the context like, who's saying that? They may even say, well, everybody knows. Wait a minute. How do we know that everybody knows that? I don't know that. Who are you to say that everybody knows that? And why are you saying that? Are you maybe pretending that it's not your idea? Why are they saying it? What is the purpose of making that claim? And how can you evaluate its truth? So these are three different contexts that are applicable in everyday life. When we go look at a advertising campaign in the MTR train, right? Who's saying that? Why are they saying it? And how can you evaluate its truth? Right? It might sound like really good toothpaste, right? But how do we know? And if we go back to those Indian sources of Mahayana Buddhist thought, teachers there, important teachers there, not all of them, suggested that there are only two ways to know what is true: personal experience and reason. Right? That is, what you have direct personal experience of yourself, and reason applied to figuring out whether or not the claim that's being made is true. It's that simple, and it's that hard. And I say simple because it's only two, not three, okay? So, experience and reason. That's how you can evaluate the truth of claims according to classic Indian Buddhist thought. So again, my thanks to the founder of the Mama Charitable Foundation lecture series, to the staff and faculty of the Center for Buddhist Studies at the University of Hong Kong, who've done a wonderful job, been very helpful to me personally and in organizing and presenting this lecture series. And to each of you for your kind attention this evening. It means a great deal to me personally and professionally, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Payne, for a very inspiring lecture. I have some questions on hand already.
So the first question is, I'm curious, why is the S added to Buddhism in the lecture series topic title? How does it carry any special meaning? Yes, as a matter of fact, okay, so it's not immediately accessible. But yes, in fact, we exchanged emails about the poster because it came back to me. I mean, I typed it out as Japanese Buddhisms, and it came back to me as Japanese Buddhism, right? And the reason that I'm using the plural is to deflate the idea that there is some one unique thing that we can call Japanese Buddhism. Right? I know there are textbooks, specialists in Japanese Buddhism, maybe I am, I'm not sure, who start way back in the Nara period. Okay, so some statues came over from Korea, and then They got thrown in the river because there was a plague, and then more nuns came over from Korea, and then there was additional stuff that happened, and some people got supported by one of the aristocratic clans, and on and on and on and on and on, right? And so we wind up with a picture that somehow there's a special characteristic shared by somebody like Gyogi back before the Kamakura period. Outrageous Buddhist figure. Right? And Kyozawa Manshi, at the turn of the 20th century, who was a very, very proper Pure Land thinker. One almost says theologian. Right? What connects Gyogi and Kyozawa Manshi? What are the characteristics? There's an assumption, because they're fit into this one line of interpretation that's called Japanese Buddhism. Right? Or how is it that Saicho is related to Kyozawa Manshi more as figures of Japanese Buddhism than he is to Zhi in the Tiantai tradition in China, whose teachings he was propagating when he got back to Japan. But classed as Japanese religion, Japanese Buddhism, is supposed to be something that connects these two figures. And how does Kyozawa Manshi and Dogen, how are they related as figures in Japanese Buddhism when Kyozawa Manshi was being exposed to modern European, well, modern in the 19th century, European thought? So the idea that there is Japanese Buddhism as a singular entity of some kind is just subtly subverted by that plural, that there are many different Buddhisms in Japan. I mean, we could have talked about the Buddhisms of Japan. Right? And I think that thinking about that gives us more opportunity to look at different factors. It isn't just one stream defined by the geography. Okay, so the question has to do with these two slogans. Just trying to encourage those with, okay. So are these slogans just being used to encourage those who do not have confidence, who do not believe that they can achieve Buddhahood? Is that the case? What's your view? No, I don't think that it's just a matter of, oh, come on, you can do it. Right? Because the entire structure, for example, of the Shingon tradition is built around this idea that through the practice you can achieve awakening, you can come in contact, you can experience the reality of your Buddha nature. So I don't think that it's just a slogan, cheering people on to greater effort. I think that it's a fundamental concept for the tradition. And I think that's my view. So Shinran interprets birth in the Pure Land as identical with awakening. What's his rationale of this interpretation? Want to build up confidence in the believers. Is this handwriting the same? Yes. Because as you said, it is a big twist down the traditional, from the traditional understanding of Pure Land. Again, I don't think that the idea that birth in the Pure Land is identical with awakening is just a matter of encouraging people. I think that this is rooted in Shinran's experience of Amida, right? That it was, how can I say this? I think he truly understood, and in part based upon his own experience, and in part based upon his reading of figures like Shandao, that what was in the sutras could be reinterpreted in a particular fashion. This doesn't address the question, and it's a little bit of a tangent, but it's the kind of thing that scholars get really fascinated with. Shinran had a very creative way of taking quotations from the scriptures, from the canon in Chinese, and like just moving things around a little tiny bit, right? So that what emerged was the meaning he understood that phrase to have. And so some of this is very technical study about the way that Shinran quoted from sutras and Chinese teachers, and the way he manipulated the language just a little bit in order to give it his own meaning. And of course, this is a natural thing in Japanese because the word order is so different from Chinese, right? So that is itself a translation project from Chinese to Japanese. And in that process, the way in which he presented it in Japanese gives it a different nuance. So no, again, I don't think that it's just a marketing slogan, right? I don't think it's something, it's not like my bumper sticker slogan, right? But it is instead, I think, what Shinran really felt to be the case. Again, based on his readings, his interpretations, his understanding, the commentaries he read, and his own personal experience. So I'm being asked, which Buddhist sect is the most influential nowadays in Japan? So there's a variety of ways of answering that question, one of which has to do with number of adherents and temples. And last I saw demographics, I think that was the Pure Land traditions collectively. Right? I think that maybe in terms of social impact, the Nichiren traditions are pretty important. In part because they have their own political party, the Komeito. And for, I don't know, a decade or more, they have been the LDP's cooperating partner. The two of them have managed to form the sufficient number of representatives in the Diet, in the House, to pass and control things. LDP lost a lot of seats this last time. Interesting change, what's going on in Japan. But even with the Komeito, which is a Nichiren political party, right, they do not have the adequate majority anymore. So different ways of answering the same question, right? Number of adherents, political power, economics, any number of different fashions. One of the things that has for a long time kind of fascinated me is that Zen looms so large, yes, in the Western scholarship, right? In the Western popular imagination about Japanese Buddhism. It's like, you say, you study Japanese Buddhism, people say, oh, so you're doing Zen. And yet, demographically in Japan, it's a pretty small sect in terms of numbers of temples and numbers of adherents. Much smaller than Shingon. Way, way smaller than Pure Land. Smaller than Nichiren. And yet, back to that uncomfortable, dynamic, historical accident. Zen looms so large. Thank you. Okay. Mm. Okay. 3 questions, all kind of related, and I'll do my best to try to answer them because you guys are really, really good. I gotta say, you come up with really good questions. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Oh, and before I forget, at a previous lecture, somebody asked a question about the Soto Zen ritual for Marichi. Are you here tonight? I'm sorry, I hoped to learn more about that ritual. But okay, so that aside, that's my personal interest. Back to this question. What made these 3 masters advocate the theories of rapid this life attainment instead of a gradual path? I think that it has to do with the way that Mahayana Buddhism had been developing, being transmitted out of India to China, and then from China to Japan. That for them, it probably wasn't so much a matter of a sharp contrast, the way that I presented it, perhaps. It wasn't like they were saying, oh, well, traditionally Buddhism says you have to have a gazillion eons of lifetimes before you can attain awakening. I'm going to choose this other thing. I think that it was just the way in which Mahayana Buddhism was developing and being taught, transmitted to generations of Buddhists in Japan. And I think that it was kind of like a gradual shift then from eons of rebirths gradually accumulating until one achieves awakening to the Mahayana notion of awakening and remaining in this world, to the Tantric notion of awakening in this lifetime. Okay? So it's kind of a progressive shift there. Were there any special relationships between their development of their theories and the social, societal, worldly needs of people in their period? This is, I think, a really difficult question. Many theorists, many historians of Japanese religion talk about the importance of the concept of mappo, that this is the period this period that we're living in is the period of the decayed Dharma, right? This is the Saha world where we can't hear it properly, we can't put it into practice, that there have been stages of decay from Shakyamuni to us that has gradually gotten worse. Right? That the world has gradually gotten worse, and that this age is the age of the false Dharma. That brigands will put on Buddhist robes, right, and pretend to be monks. That true monks will not be recognized or believed, and so on and so forth. That our lives will get shorter, that catastrophes will happen more often. Oh my gosh, catastrophes happening more often. Maybe it really is the period of mappo. So the idea of mappo was very, very powerful. And it seemed to be confirmed in this era of Japanese history because there were pandemics, there were wars, there were catastrophes, there were political upsets. Monks came down off of Mount Hiei and burned parts of the city in order to get their way. It was a very disturbed time, and those disruptions seem to accord with the idea of mappo, that this was the decayed era. So some people maintain that because of this powerful idea and because it was seemingly being confirmed by the actual conditions of life, that was what motivated people to seek out this kind of answer. One of the big problems with that is that Dogen himself strongly rejected the idea of mappo. Right? So one of these 3 teachers that was not the way he saw the world. Okay? So it's a pretty complex set of questions to answer. And, what's true for, somebody founding a sect in the era, an aristocrat, a farmer, what's true for each of them is going to be different. What makes the theories of the three masters still very popular and mainstream in Japanese Buddhism nowadays? Why do they still survive? I think in a sense they still survive because people find them valuable. I mean, that sounds really, when I say that, the words come out of my mouth and I think, well, that's a really idiotic answer. Of course, that's what it means for them to still be surviving. But if we move to a question of why do these things survive? They survive because somebody finds them to be of value. Nichiren Shoshu became very, very popular in the post-World War II era in Japan. They spread their teachings very thoroughly because they appealed to a lay audience. They said, you don't have to be a monk, you don't have to be a priest. You, an ordinary citizen, ordinary person, dislocated from your family village into a apartment complex working on, in Tokyo, without those connections, without stability. We've got something for you to do. Right? And it's simple. Just recite the name of the Lotus Sutra. Right? So yeah, there are social factors, there are economic factors. All of those are involved. I love this. As a distinguished scholar yourself, what do you consider is Buddhism, philosophy, religion, or psychology, and why? I have been pretty outspoken in arguing that it's not any of those. Right? It's Buddhism. It doesn't have to be anything else. We don't need it to be philosophy. We don't need it to be a religion. We don't need it to be psychology. It's kind of like adequate in itself. Right? And there are aspects within it that can be considered philosophy. There are aspects within it that look an awful lot like religion. There are aspects within it that can be interpreted as psychology. Right? So the answer is all of the above and none. I hope that that's an inclusive enough answer, but that's because I don't think it's useful to confine the Dharmic teachings inside of any one of those categories. It's like trying to take this really big thing and put it in a little jar. It's going to keep popping out. There's stuff that's not going to fit in there. More? Oh, goody. So Nichiren and Shinran are drawing from Mahayana Sutras. What about Dogen? Yeah, this is one of the things that's often overlooked about Dogen, is that he drew on the Lotus Sutra extensively. This is one of the problems with kind of sectarian interpretations, is that fact doesn't quite fit in well with the idea that he was a religious genius and he started this thing and we can just look at him and, see how it follows from that. No, he drew extensively on the Lotus Sutra. Much of Zen teachings in China and then in Japan draw on the Lankavatara Sutra. Some of the Prajnaparamita texts. So yes, Dogen used texts, and it's part of the modern kind of marketing of Zen to say, to take this little phrase that, oh no, this is a teaching outside the texts. This is a direct mind-to-mind transmission. And how do we know that? That's because it's in a text. Right? That's where that phrase comes from. Okay? So that phrase has been picked up because it fits nicely with certain religious themes in the West coming out of the 19th and early 20th century. Right? A rejection of textuality, an emphasis on personal experience. My personal transformative experience, that's what's really important. So there are those strains in Western religious culture that representation of Zen matched, and it became over-determined. And yet, looking at Dogen's writings, looking closely at those, yes, he's drawing extensively on Mahayana sutras. Okay, so here's another one of these really tough questions. Just wondering if Buddhism is a localized culture or a shared humanity or a universal truth, and why? Localized special interpretations. Okay. Personally, I'm not going to go with the universal truth stuff. There are, except, well, in a very specific meaning of universal. That is, if we use the term to mean something that is shared by all human beings, right? That if we look at what's universal among human beings, then yes, there are aspects of Buddhism that relate to that universal truth. Okay, not like cosmic, transcendent, written in the stars kind of universal truth. No, but what it is that's shared amongst all human beings. Right? So I think that there are aspects that are universal in that sense of what a universal truth is. Oh, but that sounds very much like shared humanity, right? Or a localized culture. I think that, okay, so here's the flip side of it. There is no such thing as Buddhism. That's an empty category that we apply to specific things in different places, what's called here a localized culture. So it's a handy term that we use to claim that it's all part of the same thing. The idea that there was a single religious tradition that could be identified as Buddhism is a relatively recent realization in European scholarship, right? Early Europeans, they ran into people in India, right, who were worshiping this incarnation of Vishnu, I guess it is. In Southeast Asia, they were doing this other stuff. China, they were doing Japan, other stuff still. It didn't all look the same to them. Right? It looked like different things. And it was only over about a century that different people began to put together the realization that this was all part of the same tradition. And on the flip side, as recently as the World Congress of Buddhists in 1956, 58, somewhere around there, The organizers of that in Burma, they didn't want to allow the Japanese to participate because they knew that the Japanese aren't real Buddhists. Those Japanese priests, they drink sake, they eat meat, and they marry. So they're not real Buddhists, so we're not going to have them here at our big convention. Right? I don't think that that worked, but that was, local culture in one place versus a claim to a universal form of Buddhism in another place, and a standard set according to some particular markers. This is what we mean by real Buddhism. What they're doing, that's not it. Right? Today, scholarship says now it's a version. Right? It's a different form. Every form is local, and it is our perception of similarity and difference. Remember that? Yeah? That our mind is based on the perception of similarity and difference. That's how we figure out that there is something that we can call Buddhism by looking at all these different instances. Right? I hope that that works as an answer. But there's somebody.
Okay. Yeah, the last question.
Professor, that's that you are a monk. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I just a little bit related the question. I searched online, said, Professor, you are a monk and the Singong tradition. Is that what that means? This online. I wonder is the correct or wrong idea.
So I use the term priest, not monk. I am not a monastic. Right? Dr. Tony will tell you. Yeah. We went out to dinner last night. It was great. I had a steak. Okay. Of course, I'm in the Japanese tradition, but no. So this is a distinction in English. It works in English. There are monks who live a monastic life in monasteries with other monks. And then there are almost freelance, right? Individual people who have authorization in the Shingon tradition. The authorization that I received would allow me to start a temple, to call it a Shingon temple, to perform rituals. I would have to take another set of, another step to be able to call that temple a Koyasan Shingon temple. Okay, so that my teacher knew that I was not, that wasn't what I was doing. I was an academic, right? So we did not add that additional step. But the basic initiation, the set of trainings and the initiatory process led to my being able to do those things. I have the authority to do that on my own. I don't glow in the dark, however.
Thank you once again to Professor Payne for your very insightful lecture this time. And thank you also for all your good questions, enabling us to all learn more from Professor Payne and from each other. And we very much hope that there can be a chance for us to learn from you more in the future. And we are, once again, very grateful to the Mama Charitable Foundation for its very generous support to make this lecture series possible. And thank you to you all. Thank you very much. And of course, thank you to you all for joining, and we hope to see you all in our future events. Thank you and have a nice evening.